Hello friends, welcome back to the channel. In today's video, I shall discuss the summary of last 19 chapters of Jane Austen's famous novel Pride and Prejudice. In the last two videos, I have already discussed the plot of the first 42 chapters. So in the last video, in which I have discussed the summary of the second part of the novel, that means chapter number 24 to 42. In that video, I have shown that the second part ends with some hopes and some threats. The first hope is that our heroine Elizabeth has now started to develop. She is now realizing her faults and she has to some extent realized Darcy's generosity, Darcy's true character, and at the same time now she can realize the dark nature, the villainy of the scoundrel Wickham. So that's really a great development. The second point is that Darcy, who has started to develop almost from the chapter number 6, has also greatly matured. He has discarded his snobbishness, his prejudiced view of the rural class, and he is now ready to accept Elizabeth with her family. He is now ready to accept Elizabeth's financial condition, family position, social status and rank. He has started to love Elizabeth's true nature. Jane, Elizabeth's sister, who was very naive and innocent, has also started to develop. Jane has now become successful to understand real nature of Caroline Bingley. Another hope with which the second part ends is Darcy's declaration of love for Elizabeth. That is also very important episode of this novel. But there was a threat, and the threat is Lydia's and Kitty's irresponsibility, and at the same time Mr. Bennet's weakness as a father. Mr. Bennet is still very indifferent to his daughters. He never tries to control Lydia and Kitty, and we have seen that Lydia and Kitty, they are now ready for their amorous adventures with men in uniform, and even Lydia is now going to Brighton with the army regiment. Okay, so this is the threat. The third volume opens with chapter number 43, and this chapter is one of the most significant chapters of Pride and Prejudice. Here we find Elizabeth's visit to Pemberley with Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner. Elizabeth and Mr. and Mrs. Gardiners, they are guided by Mrs. Reynolds, the housekeeper of Pemberley, and she praises Mr. Darcy effusively, and Elizabeth tries to understand if that Darcy is the same man she has known so far. Okay. And after they are visiting the house on the ground of the estate, they suddenly meet Mr. Darcy as he has returned home unexpectedly. So Elizabeth was alarmed, she was shocked, not because she meets Darcy suddenly, but Darcy appears so hospitable and decent to her and her uncle and aunt. After that, Mr. Darcy asks Elizabeth if he might introduce his sister Georgiana Darcy with Elizabeth. That also impresses Elizabeth. So this chapter is really very important, because here we see that Elizabeth has discovered a new man in Darcy. But remember one thing, Darcy has not changed. The change is not outward, it is inward, and it is in Elizabeth. Okay, Elizabeth has removed the glass of prejudice from her eyes, and now she is watching Darcy as he is. Okay, it is prejudiced view of Elizabeth that makes Darcy, or that represents Darcy to the reader as a proud, snobbish man. Okay, now Elizabeth has started to realize the real nature of Darcy. So this is really a very important chapter. In the next chapter, we find that Elizabeth meets with Mr. Bingley there in the next day, and with Miss Darcy, that means Georgiana Darcy, and she finds Georgiana a really very loving and a very sweet girl. Okay, and Elizabeth also casts away her anger against Bingley when Bingley Bingley asks about Jane's well-being. Okay, so Elizabeth becomes happy that Mr. Bingley is still interested in Jane. After that, Elizabeth also gets some news and information from other people of Pemberley, that how generous, how great is Darcy, and how treacherous is Wickham. That also clears Elizabeth's mind more and more. So through experience, through testimony of others, Elizabeth gradually evolving as a better character. In chapter number 45, Elizabeth meets Caroline Bingley, and she finds that Caroline is still the same woman. Caroline sardonically hints at the army regiment in Meryton, because Elizabeth has some kind of affair, very short affair with Wickham. And Caroline also blames Darcy that once you hated this girl and now you are praising Elizabeth. So Darcy accepts the accusation that it is right, once I hated this girl, but that is when I knew her first, that is at the beginning. But for the several months, Darcy has been considering that Elizabeth is the girl, is one of the most handsome girl he has ever met. Okay, so Darcy rejects Caroline's charge. So Darcy and Elizabeth, they are gradually coming together, and at that moment the greatest threat to their relationship appears in the form of a letter from Jane. In that letter, Jane informs that Lydia has eloped with Wickham, and a letter which follows, there is another bad news that perhaps Lydia has not been married to Wickham. So this news almost destroys Elizabeth's hope for Darcy. So when Elizabeth informs Darcy about this incident, Darcy remains silent, sober, composed, and Elizabeth feels perplexed. But she is now sure that Darcy will never marry Elizabeth. Okay, because of that kind of family scandal. So after that, Elizabeth is now ready to return to Longbourn. So while their trip to Longbourn, Mr. Gardiner, that means Elizabeth's uncle, is optimistic that Wickham will marry Lydia. Wickham will not be so vicious as not to marry Lydia, but Elizabeth is pessimistic because Elizabeth knows very clearly that Wickham is totally dedicated to mercenary purpose, totally dedicated to materialistic purpose, and that has been proved by Wickham's affair with Miss King, okay, in the second volume. And Elizabeth is also pessimistic about Lydia. Elizabeth knows that Lydia will remain an irresponsible girl throughout her life. Elizabeth is also pessimistic about her family because there is her irresponsible father, weak father, and her foolish, senseless mother. Okay, so Elizabeth is completely in a pessimistic condition. So after returning to Longbourn, Elizabeth discovers the house in a total gloom, as there is no news of Lydia and Wickham. Mr. Bennet has left his easy chair. He has gone to London, but there is no good news from him. He has not been successful to discover Lydia and Wickham. After that, Mr. Bennet returns home, and then there is a letter from Mr. Collins. In that letter, Mr. Collins informed that he and Lady D. Catherine Borg, they both are aware of that scandal, and Mr. Collins and Lady Catherine think that this kind of scandal will destroy the fortune of all the girls of the family. So this shows how senseless, cruel Mr. Collins can be. He is writing this kind of condescending letter at that moment when the family is in great shame. Okay. So in the next chapter, we find that there is some ray of hope to the family, as Mr. Gardiner, who has gone to London to help Mr. Bennet to trace Lydia and Wickham. A letter has arrived from him, and he has informed that Lydia and Wickham, they have been traced, and Wickham is now ready to marry Lydia, but for some proviso. Okay, proviso means for some conditions. What are they? That he needs a dowry, and his demand is of £100 each year until Mr. Bennet is alive. After Mr. Bennet's death, he wants Lydia's fair share of £5,000, which is Mr. Bennet's legacy. Okay, so that surprises Elizabeth and Mr. Bennet, that a greedy man like Wickham is ready to marry a foolish girl like Lydia for such a small dowry. Okay, Mr. Bennet comments that a man who is ready to marry a worthless girl like Lydia for less than £10,000 dowry is actually a fool. And they after that conclude that perhaps it is Mr. Gardiner who has done some human thing, who has done some kind job there, and it is probably Mr. Gardiner has paid a large amount to Wickham to get him agreed to marry Lydia. After that, in chapter number 50, we find a criticism of elder Bennets, how they were spendthrift, how they have spent a lot, and now the family is on the verge of financial crisis. Okay, then we find Elizabeth's sense of loss. Elizabeth is now realizing that she really loves Darcy, and the realization comes at a moment when Elizabeth is sure that in no way Darcy will be ready to marry her, because in that case Darcy will be the brother-in-law of George Wickham, the man he probably most detested. Okay, Darcy hates Wickham's, so he will never be agreed to marry Elizabeth. After that, Mr. Bennet, who was very adamant that he will never see again Lydia and Wickham, he pacifies and he is now agreed to invite Lydia and Wickham to invite them to Longbourn. In the next chapter, Lydia and Wickham, they arrived at Longbourn and they are shameless, confident fellow as they were. There was no sign of shame in them that they have done such kind of thing. Okay, and Lydia is chattering senselessly and her mother is praising her daughter's success. She is very happy that one of her daughter is now married. At that moment, Lydia has done a very good job unconsciously. That is a slip of tongue of Lydia, and that informs Elizabeth that Mr. Darcy was present at the marriage of Lydia and Wickham, and that information stunned Elizabeth, that why Mr. Darcy is present at the marriage. So Elizabeth writes a letter to Mrs. Gardiner for explanation, because Mr. Gardiner was present at the marriage, and Mrs. Gardiner sends a letter in chapter number 52, and that letter explains Darcy's role behind the marriage, that it is Darcy who went to London, traced Wickham and Lydia and paid a bribe to get Wickham ready to marry Lydia. Okay, so it is completely Darcy's achievement that he has somehow saved the Bennet's family from a great scandal. This chapter is an eye-opener for Elizabeth. Elizabeth is shocked, Elizabeth is stunned, Elizabeth is pleased, and she is now ecstatic. She is realizing that Darcy still loves her. Okay, but she is not sure whether she will be able to marry Darcy, and she is in pain now that probably Jane's future will be ruined by this scandal. Okay. So in chapter number 53, there is some good news. First is that Lydia and Wickham, they are departing and probably they will not return soon. The second news is that Mr. Bingley will arrive Netherfield in some days and he will live in Netherfield for some time. That means there is again some hope for Jane. After a few days, Mr. Bingley and Darcy, they arrive at Longbourn and they visit the family, Bennet family. And in that meeting, in that dinner, Mr. Bingley talks friendly, amicably as he was. But Darcy is in a very brooding mood. He is silent, unsociable, uncommunicative. Okay, that puzzles Elizabeth. Though Elizabeth has realized that Darcy is a shy guy, he is a shy man, but still she is to some extent puzzled that why Darcy is so uncommunicative. In the next chapter, we find that Mr. Bingley has proposed to Jane, and that has made the Bennet family very proud and happy. And after some days, Darcy leaves for London and Mr. Bingley is now living in the Netherfield Park alone. So one of the problem of Bennet's family has been solved, that Jane is now engaged to Mr. Bingley. At that time, in chapter number 56, Lady Catherine de Bourgh arrives at Longbourn and she is in a very belligerent mood. Okay, belligerent means in a very she is ready to fight. She appears like a demon. She demands, she cajoles, she requests, she threats Elizabeth that she has to liquidate means she has to break her engagement with Darcy. So Elizabeth is not actually engaged to Darcy. She does not know anything about it, but Elizabeth replied fittingly to Lady Catherine de Bourgh, and Lady Catherine de Bourgh leaves Longbourn, threatening Elizabeth and her family that she will destroy them. In the next chapter, Elizabeth thinks about the rumor that she has been engaged to Darcy, because there was actually no engagement, and she realizes that there is very little possibility, because now Lady Catherine de Bourgh has become active to stop Darcy to do something, and Darcy is a man who has the sense of dignity, who respects family's honor, social status, rank, social position, family's connection. So probably he will be agreed to Lady Catherine de Bourgh views, and that will be a great loss to Elizabeth. So Elizabeth becomes very sad. At that moment, we find that Darcy again returns. Okay, and in one day, while Darcy and Elizabeth is walking, Darcy and Elizabeth are walking. They discuss about their mistakes, about their prejudices, about their wrong views in first impressions, and then Darcy proposes to Elizabeth, and they get engaged. Okay, and this news brings greater joy to Bennet family, but at the same time all the members was very much surprised. Jane is shocked that Elizabeth is now agreed to marry Darcy, because she knows that Elizabeth always hates Darcy. So now Elizabeth has to explain to everybody that how generous Darcy is actually, and all of them are now indebted to Darcy. They are grateful to Darcy, because it is Darcy who has made possible the marriage of Wickham and Lydia. Okay, so now two couples are to be married, Jane and Charles Bingley, Elizabeth and Darcy, and there were now many well-wishers. Okay, even Mr. Collins has arrived at Longbourn with Charlotte, because he fled from Rosings to save himself from the threat of Lady Catherine de Bourgh. And in the last chapter, we find that after the marriage, Elizabeth is living happily with Darcy and Jane is living happily with Charles Bingley. But they were frequently called by Lydia and Wickham to solve their financial problems. Okay, so here the story ends, and at the end we find that the problems that has been started between Elizabeth and Darcy has been solved, and both appear as a very sensible, rational human being. Okay, there is no rash thinking, no passionate emotional outburst. They are very sensible people who ponders over their emotion, who analyzes their views, and then they accept each other. This is the proper kind of marriage that Jane Austen has championed in this novel. At the same time, the novel focused on the rigid social class structure, the prejudices that are associated with the class structure, and the social condition of women in Regency England at the beginning of 19th century. That has also been portrayed by Jane Austen. So I am concluding the discussion here. If you have not seen the last two videos, please first make sure to watch that two videos also, because that will provide you necessary information about the earlier chapters. Okay. Also, I want to say one thing, that if you like this kind of video, please subscribe to the channel, and also if you find this video helpful, share it with your friends. Thank you.